If you invest all of your money in just one type of asset, if there's a problem in the market and there's a problem with those assets, you're going to lose all your money. But if you diversify your assets, then if there's a problem with one of those assets, then you have others that are going to maybe go up, and then your money is going to be well secured. Well, it's the same with biodiversity. The more diverse the system, the more stable and the more functioning it's going to be.
Hello and welcome to SciLax, the podcast for people who love science or don't yet know that they do. And in today's episode, our guest is Professor Ainhoa Magrach, who is an environmental researcher working at the BC3, the Basque Center for Climate Change in Spain. Ainhoa's research projects address the impacts of climate change, land use change, and agricultural practices on ecosystems and biodiversity. Ainhoa, thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you for having me.
When I was preparing for the episodes, I also visited your Instagram account, actually, and I noticed that you say that you're a dreamer. So I wanted to start with that. Is it easy to be a dreamer when you have such a research topic?
I would say yes, because most of the things that I currently do, I was dreaming of when I was a child. So it's making a lot of my dreams come true. And normally our day-to-day work is really dreamy. We spend a lot of time in the field, looking at nature, looking at biodiversity, which is what a lot of us really have always wanted to do. Of course, we have all these issues that we come across, all the impacts that nature is suffering, but we want to see the positive side always. We want to see ways in which we can improve with our work, the way nature is being treated and conserved around the world.
Okay, but I guess you know why I asked that, right? Because in general, I mean, I am very happy that climate change is so present because it's one of those topics that definitely the science communication of is really developed. But at the same time, there have been some scientific studies on the climate anxiety and all the things that, you know, people might feel because of being aware what is happening.
Yes. So I think that at present, most people know what climate change is. They know what causes climate change. The challenge now for us as researchers is how we talk about these issues to people. Currently, a lot of these topics are framed in a very catastrophic way, and people sometimes end up thinking that, well, everything is lost, so why should I change anything of what I do if we're just going to disappear? So they continue with business as usual. So I think that what we need now is to keep the urgency. So there's an issue there and we need to do something, but also make people feel that their actions matter and that there are solutions and that we can do things if we share our responsibility together. So there's also a huge problem of accountability. When we think about climate change, it often feels like abstract or distant, or that someone else should do something, governments, companies, other people. But I think that we can also do something and that the responsibilities should be shared. I think that we need to find the positive parts of what we can still do and not so much all the horrible things that are happening.
So what you're saying is that people are actually aware of climate change. We don't have to tell them once again what is the reason we have it. Everybody is aware, like average person or not. Because I noticed that the communication about it is very often you start from scratch, you start from the beginning. By the way, it's human caused.
I think that we all know that. Of course, there is a minority that want to challenge these findings that the whole scientific community agrees on. But in this sense, there's always a minority that is challenging anything we can discuss, especially now when there's a lot of polarization and people are just trying to take extreme views of a lot of topics, climate change being one of them. But I think that the majority of the people, especially in Europe, they are very much aware that climate change is a thing. We've been suffering some of the warmest summers in the past decades across the whole of Europe. And I think that everyone also is aware that it's mainly caused by the activities of humans. I think the main discussion is how do we go about changing this? And that's where there's really an issue. How are my activities or my footprint how I'm going to change that to make sure that this doesn't continue to happen.
Okay, I will ask you about the solutions later on. But first of all, just to also introduce listeners, I guess, okay, we can leave climate change there. One of the topics that is big is obviously biodiversity. And that's what people often discuss as the loss of biodiversity being caused by climate change. But actually, why is it so important? Why should we worry about it? It's just some animals somewhere there. I mean, does it really influence our lives? I guess you get, I'm joking a little bit here, right? But
Yeah. So there's a lot of research that has already shown that more diverse ecosystems tend to be more stable, tend to support more functions. They're better at absorbing shocks. So when there's a drought, a heat wave, pests, or things that affect natural ecosystems, when there's more diversity in those ecosystems, they are more able to withstand those perturbations. And this matters for not only the natural world, but also for the ecosystem services that they provide us. Things like food production or water regulation, even climate mitigation is going to depend on how diverse those ecosystems are. Because at the end, biodiversity is like an insurance. So when you have more species, they each respond differently to changes in the environmental conditions. So the more species you have, the easier it is that more of those species will be able to support all those different conditions. So when we talk about this, we go like to the economic world and think of like when you invest your money, if you invest all of your money in just one type of asset, if there's a problem in the market and there's a problem with those assets, you're going to lose all your money. But if you diversify your assets, then if there's a problem with one of those assets, then you have others that are going to maybe go up, and then your money is going to be well secured. Well, it's the same with biodiversity. The more diverse the system, the more stable and the more functioning it's going to be.
is it important also that they are local native species or not for biodiversity?
So when we think of species, they don't live in isolation in these natural ecosystems. It's not like the species and its importance, and it's not alone. It's interacting with all these other species. So when you think of, for example, plant species, they are interacting with all the herbivores that are eating plant material. They're interacting with pollinators that pollinate those flowers, seed dispersals that are eating the fruits and taking the seeds to different places. And a lot of those interactions have been shaped by many, many years of common evolution between the species that interact. So when you introduce a species from a different place, then a lot of those interactions, they can be changed because of the introduction of that new species, and there can be cascading impact across the whole ecosystem if you introduce a new player into the system. So normally native species, they are better adapted to the local conditions, but also to the local species that they have interacted with for such a long time.
We're talking a lot about the number of species and how important it is. So I think it's a good moment for you to ask the pub quiz question that is a little bit related to that, let's say. And listeners, remember the answer only at the end of the podcast.
So my question is, which group is more diverse, has more species across the world? Birds or bees?
Great question, I think. And of course, remember, answer only at the end of the podcast. I have to now look at some of the terms because I have to say that when I was preparing, not everything was clear to me. And I know I probably studied it at school, but I don't remember the definitions. So one of the descriptions about you was saying that you worked in 4 different biogeographic realms and 5 different biomes. What does it actually mean?
Biogeographic realms and biomes, they're basically large regions of the world that share evolutionary history, climate, and this includes things like, for example, tropical forests or Mediterranean ecosystems or temperate grasslands. So fortunately, I've had the opportunity to work in different places. So I did my PhD, for example, in Chile, in an island called Chiloé in the south, and that's a rainforest. It's not a tropical rainforest, but it has kind of the same structure of a tropical rainforest, but with very cool winters and summers. Then I had the opportunity to go to Australia, work in Borneo as well, in tropical rainforests. And then I've worked in Europe and in different countries and in different ecosystems. And this is good because this has allowed me to have some perspective of what different ecosystems are suffering, because there are some common patterns for them, but there are also specifics for those different ecosystems. And to really understand how biodiversity loss is a widespread phenomenon that is happening around the world.
But does it mean then that you would choose those realms on the basis of certain species you were looking at? What was the reason that you decided to do that? Was it looking for the patterns, as you said, to find, or why was it like that? I know that in research it's sometimes a little bit random because, well, there was funding somewhere.
Yeah, it definitely was a little bit random and based on the availability of research, also specific people that I wanted to work with. But really the main reason was I always wanted to work in the tropics. So that's why I moved for a period of my life to work in different tropical ecosystems, just because the diversity that you find there is like nothing that you can find anywhere in Europe. And so to be exposed to that kind of huge diversity for me was like really a dream come true.
And that's the dream part that we discussed in the very beginning, right? But okay, so now let's talk about dream, for me at least, hummingbirds, because to be honest, I've seen them only once in my life, so we cannot compare. But I remember that moment, and it's absolutely mind-boggling. I think it's just really, they are amazing. So I'm not surprised you do look into them a little bit more. Although I have to say that when I was preparing today, I looked a little bit into the Basque language. And I noticed that you had a couple of years ago some kind of a competition for the best word in your language. Do you know what it was?
No idea.
It was actually
Hummingbird.
butterfly. Butterfly was chosen. So yes, I guess probably because hummingbird is probably a loan word from Spanish, no? So it's not really very much a special word in your language. But anyway, going back, this was a tangent. Sorry, just wanted to tell you because
No, it's interesting because actually butterfly has multiple words. You can say butterfly in multiple different ways in the Basque language. So you have like chimeleta, pimpilimpausa. There's like different words for that.
Yeah, exactly. So I think the pimpi, sorry, some pimpi, whatever. Right? Yes, exactly. I think that's the word that won. Sorry, I'm not trying to pronounce this. Anyway, going back to hummingbirds, a little bit first about the fact that your studying of hummingbirds is about the fact that they are pollinators, right? That's what interests you.
Yes, so hummingbirds, they only occur in the Americas, but there they are huge pollinators of a lot of plants there, and they're really good at pollinating, and there's a lot of species as well over there.
So first of all, pollinators, I thought these were only bees. Hummingbirds, like I think this is difficult for them, right? Because I would assume that you have to be a bit furry to pollinate, or it doesn't matter.
Bees are really good because amongst other things, they are kind of furry. Pollen grains, they get attached there. But when we think of pollinators, there's a huge diversity of species that actually do pollination. So in insects, we have bees as like one of the main, but we also have flies and hoverflies, and those are not hairy either, but they are super important pollinators. Then we have beetles as well doing pollinator work. We even have ants. There's lizards that also do pollination in some islands. And then you have birds like sunbirds as well, for example, in Australia or South Africa, and hummingbirds. What you have with hummingbirds, it's really studied in like coevolutionary studies because they have evolved with a lot of plant species, and their bills, their beaks, they fit perfectly into a lot of these really tubular and long tubed flowers that you can find there. And then they have evolved together such that the pollen of those flowers ends up in the head of the pollinators, of the hummingbirds, and they take it then to another flower, so it stays on the feathers, on the beak, and everywhere. But yeah, they're really cool. And also because some of them, they migrate like really long distances, and they could take the pollen very far away.
What is actually pollination? A bit of a revision for people who don't know exactly what it is.
Plants cannot move, of course, right? They are rooted onto the soils, and so they can't really move. And so when it comes to reproduction, they need a little bit of help there. And so there's a lot of plant species that are wind pollinated, which means that they develop a lot of pollen, and then whenever the wind comes, all of the pollen flies around, and all of the allergic people, they are aware of this. And then randomly, some of that pollen would reach the flowers of the same species, of another individual of the same species. But a lot of the plant species, they've evolved flowers to attract animals. And this is perfect for pollination because it ensures that the pollen that is taken by these animals is then taken to another flower. So the probability of actual pollination is much larger than if you just depend on the wind and wherever that takes you. So something like 85% of plant species we have, they depend on animals, different animals, to take the pollen from one side to another and to be able to reproduce. At the end of the day, pollen is the masculine part of plants that is then deposited on the styles of the flowers, which is kind of the feminine part. And then, well, baby plants are made.
And is it actually that whenever you transport the pollen, so the pollinator moves it, as you said, from the male to the female, pollination happens or not? Is there something else that is needed? Can it be that, okay, we preserve all the pollinators and the plants, but there is something more to it that will not work?
Yes, well, it's more complicated than that because, of course, not all pollinators are equally efficient in how good they are taking this pollen. So, just like I was telling you about the hummingbirds, that the pollen is deposited, for example, on the head, or the pollen needs to be deposited in a place that's going to then be able to touch the style of the next flower that they're going to visit. If there's for example, a very large species that's pollinating, and imagine that the pollen stays here and then the style is in a different part of the body, then that pollen might not actually touch the style. So there's a kind of a mismatch between that pollinator and that plant species. So not always when a pollinator takes pollen is the pollen then deposited on the next flower. It depends on where it is deposited. That's why there's pollinators that are way more efficient than others. So for example, a tinier pollinator that is able to just enter the whole flower and get its whole body full of pollen might be able to then go to another flower and just at least one part of its body will touch the reproductive part. It really depends on the structure of the flower, on the structure of the pollinators. And that's again why we need such a diverse array of pollinators, because not all pollinators are going to work for all the plants. There's combinations of them that are going to work better.
So it doesn't mean that it's one plant that is dependent on one particular species.
There are cases where some species only depend on one pollinator species. For example, there was this flower species that Charles Darwin found in an island that had a really long tube. And he predicted that there had to exist some kind of moth that had a tongue that was as long as the tube of this flower. And he wasn't able to see it, but they actually discovered this moth years later. And this was a very specialized interaction where the tube was so long that only this particular moth could reach the nectar at the end and thus touch the pollen and be the pollinator of this plant. But that's not the most common thing because, again, this is like an insurance. If the moth species were to become extinct, then this plant species would become extinct directly. So most of the plants, they've kind of evolved towards having more than one pollinator species that's able to pollinate them, because otherwise they would become extinct very easily if that pollinator were to disappear.
Of course, I mean, evolution in the end, right? Or they would have to adapt somehow so other types of species could access them. I did say kind of I'm biased because I just find hummingbirds fascinating. But what about you? How did it start? Because again, it's not, as you said, it's not a species that you can find locally where you live.
And when I was a child, I think I saw a documentary about hummingbirds and I just was amazed at those creatures. And I remember it being like one of these clips where they do a slow motion and you could see how they move their wings in kind of like 8 shapes. So for me, it was amazing. But then when I had the opportunity to do my PhD in Chile, there was a hummingbird species there and I could do some studies with them and just spending my days looking at hummingbirds do their thing for me was just amazing. So I've always wanted to continue work on that. So I've done some work after that with hummingbirds that migrate from Mexico to Alaska, following them. And I would love to continue to do that.
So how do you actually study them? I mean, I'm of course, obviously already thinking of studying, I don't know, primates, Jane Goodall style or whatever, but how do you study hummingbirds? What does it entail?
It's very similar. It entails a person sitting and looking at specific flowers and waiting for hummingbirds to come and visit. And then you time those interactions. You count how many flowers they visit. or you could either be doing kind of a transect where you're walking for a specific amount of time and then you're looking at all the hummingbirds that interact with those flowers. You record which flower species, how many flowers, for how long. You could do many different things. For example, in part of my PhD in Chile, what I did is I had nets across the study site and I was capturing these hummingbirds. And what we did is we had it's kind of a thing that you can use to collect the pollen that they have in their heads. And then you melt this and you can look at the microscope at the pollen grains. So we were obtaining these samples from all the hummingbirds that we had to really see how many pollen grains are there transporting one from one site to another, from how many species, and these kinds of things. So there's multiple studies that you can do.
What about the migration? I mean, I assume you're not flying next to them. Is it like a sensor thing that you put, I don't know, type of GPS to see how they migrate?
So because hummingbirds are such beautiful creatures and everyone loves hummingbirds, there's websites where people record fauna that they see. And for hummingbirds, there's a lot of records of when they are being sighted, what particular day, etc. So what I could do is using these data from the past 10 years, I could say, okay, I know that August 25, these birds normally are in California. And so I would go to a specific location in California where those birds had been sighted very frequently in the past 10 years. Same for Alaska and same for Mexico. So we didn't actually follow the migration. We just went to the particular locations where we knew that they were found more frequently. And we looked at populations at those different locations at the different points in time as they were going upward.
Once again, we have to remind our listeners how citizen science is really, really important, right? And in some of the episodes, we discussed also, I don't know if it was iNaturalist that you were using, but one of these type of websites are really important for research. And exactly, you start from there and then you can actually already aim at the right place because of the recordings that citizens do, which is important. And I will share the link in the show notes, of course.
Yeah, it's iNaturalist, eBird. There's a lot of websites where people share this, and specifically when you work with birds, there's a lot of bird enthusiasts out there that are doing an amazing work, and thanks to them, we can then go and half our work is already done.
Well, half, probably 30%. No. Depends
finding
what you have
the
to
locations
do.
And for me, for example, when I went to Alaska, it's like finding a needle in a haystack, right? It's like a very large area and there's very few pollinators, there's very few hummingbirds, there's only this species that goes all the way up there. And so to be able to have that information that in this particular site I was going to definitely find them was really helpful.
And then I guess you start with the plant. You just base yourself next to the plants and you wait.
Yeah, and they will come.
Okay. How many hours does it normally entail until they come?
So Alaska is different because there's very few of them, but places like California where there's a lot of them, they are there all the time. And then you can also hear them. They make a noise and they're coming. And sometimes it's difficult, even there's so many interactions going on that recording is actually the difficult part.
And recording in that sense, do I imagine it correctly? You just have a pen and paper recording, or it's all digitalized?
You can either have a pen and paper, or sometimes I actually have a voice recorder.
For?
To say, this bird, this many minutes, blah, 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 blah. Sometimes it's so fast that you don't even have the time to actually write down stuff. So you would do that and then go through your notes.
Okay, and then onto the data. So you gathered all this data from your field work. What do you do with it? Recent projects, for example, is it also hummingbirds related or not?
So in the past couple of years, because I've been based mostly in Europe and mostly here in the Basque country, we've started like a long-term study in an area here where we've been working for the past 7 years. And it's been mostly with like insect species and the plants that they pollinate. So we have a lot of bees, but then again, a lot of hoverflies, beetles, other insects that are also super important pollinators. And what we do with this data is we do a lot of statistics. So we also do a kind of network analysis where we use kind of like what people use to analyze like social media and interactions in those social media between different people and different profiles. We do that with plants and pollinators. We join them through these links if they interact or if they don't. And then you can look at emergent properties of those communities that take into account the whole community, not just the individual species, because what we're really interested in is how species interact and how those interactions are shaped when you introduce some kind of perturbation to the system.
Human influence, you mean, or not necessarily?
Yeah. So, for example, we have been working a lot on agriculture and how moving into a more intensified agricultural system really affects species and how they interact. In the case of our study area in particular, what we've been looking at is the introduction of managed honeybee hives and how this has an impact for the native pollinators that are in these landscapes. So we've been actually doing experiments and we have introduced ourselves those hives to look at the impacts that they have.
And what are the impacts? I know it's not so easy to say it's like this, but might be, let's say.
Yeah. So in our case, we just did those experiments this spring. So I don't have the results for this particular study, but I've studied this in other regions. So in the south of Spain, for example, in Doñana, we had a study where we looked at the impact of areas that had a lot of honeybee hives. And we found that having this huge amount of honeybees in a system, it leads to competition with wild pollinators that end up shifting the flowers that they're feeding on, because the honeybees, they tend to focus on the most abundant species of plant and they take up all those resources. And this makes wild pollinators, they have to shift to other less abundant resources. We also found that for the plants, it wasn't really good to have all these honeybees because some plants, they suffered a decrease in their production of seeds because honeybees are not necessarily the best pollinators for those specific species. So as we said earlier, there's been a coevolution between plants and their pollinators for a very long time, and not all the pollinators are equally efficient. So when we use honeybees everywhere to pollinate all of our crops, for example, it's very difficult that this one single species is going to be the most efficient pollinator for all the plant species, for all the crops, or for all the wild plants. And so we found that that is the case. Not all the plants are benefited by increasing just the number of one species of pollinator.
And that's also an issue, right? Because when you say pollinators, I guess people think honeybees most of the times, right?
Yes, so exactly. When I tell people I work with pollinators and they're like, oh, honeybees, I love honey. And then you're like, well, no, there's a lot of bee species. We will have the number later, but they don't resemble honeybees at all. Like most of those species are solitary species. They don't have like this queen worker situation. They don't make honey. And actually, honeybees are kind of being negative for them because they compete with them. A lot of these honeybees, they also carry pathogens that they are then taking into the natural world and transmitting to these wild pollinators. So yeah, not good.
What about the insect houses? Is that good that it's a trendy thing that people build those or not?
I think depending on what the objective of those bee hotels are. For me, if the objective is to raise awareness among the citizens, then that's perfect because it tells them about like there's other bee species and not all of them make these hives. Some of them, they live in like this kind of tubes or holes in the wood, or they maybe nest underground, and people learn about this. But those hotels are not going to make up for the loss of nesting habitats that we have in natural ecosystems. So yeah, if the objective is to save species, I don't think that those hotels are going to work. If the objective is to raise awareness and have people know more about how these species live, then that's perfect.
Yeah, I also read somewhere that it's because it's trending that very often they are actually not designed in a way that would be conducive for the species to come. So yes, you can buy some like a do-it-yourself versions for kids, and then you start building, and then you start reading, and you realize, well, no, not necessarily. So okay, yes, if you come with the knowledge instead of just building, then as you're saying, raising awareness is always good, but there's more to it as well. I think we're slowly moving to solutions now. So let's not be, negative too much and move a little bit to what we can do. So first of all, yes, we know that agriculture does influence biodiversity, the way we use farmland and everything like that. How can we improve biodiversity actually in a cost effective way and in a way that the farmers will accept? What would be your suggestions for the future?
Okay, I think that the good news for this in agricultural landscapes is that having more biodiversity is not a trade-off with them having a greater yield. There are simple measures, for example, planting flower strips, having hedgerows, diversifying the crops that you're planting. So, not going for a single monoculture, but rather having different types of crops in the area. This is going to really boost biodiversity in the area, reduce the amount of pesticides that are used. This improves biodiversity, but it also is going to improve important services for those farmers, like pest control that you're going to get for free. For example, if you have a more diverse system, you have more bird species there, they can eat a lot of the pests that you are going to have in your crops, and they do that for free without you needing to use pesticides. Same for pollinators. If you have a more diverse system with different crop species that flower at different points in time, then there's going to be more resources for those pollinators to live on for a longer period of time, and they are going to pollinate those crops for you. So this is going to lead to greater yields and also to more stable yields through time. So I think that what we need is smarter landscapes where we take into account both the productivity but also how to maintain biodiversity in those areas. And the good thing is that we showed with a study that we did with data here from Spain that areas that had greater crop diversity and more semi-natural habitat and that had plots that were smaller had greater productivity values than those that were more kind of following the intensification of agriculture. So the good news is that it's possible and it's actually cost effective.
Cost effective on that side, but then, there is a reason why we have monoculture, right? Because it's I don't know, certain things pay more. That's why farmers switch into that. Am I thinking correctly, or is just my wrong approach?
I think there's multiple things going on there. A lot of times, farmers are also not the only people who decide what they plant. Sometimes this comes from the European Union or their own government that pushes towards a specific type of crop. Other times, they follow whatever their neighbors are doing. But what happens when you have a monoculture is that if anything happens to that monoculture, if there's a pest, if there's a pathogen, you're going to lose your whole crop. Whereas if you have a more diverse system, it's very infrequent that you have the same kind of pest or the same kind of pathogen affect different crop species. So if you lose part of your crop for one species, you're going to have it for another one. So I think there's a mixture of things going on here.
What about other solutions for halting biodiversity loss? What can we do? Because I really don't want to finish with, okay, it's getting worse and that's it, right? As we already said, we can change things.
Yeah. So in agricultural systems, we can maintain a lot of semi-natural habitat without it being bad for the crops that are grown there. Within our own cities, there's a lot of things that we can do in the parks, in our own gardens, in our everywhere to really maintain that. I think that what we need is really to think that there is room for improvement, to not think that everything is lost. But also a lot of things that we can do come from our governments. So voting is also really important. So the person you're going to vote is really going to make a difference there. So more than just our individual actions, there's a collective action there that comes many times from whoever you voted for.
And here obviously comes also the decision makers taking evidence-based decisions, right? And the dialogue between the scientists and politicians and so on and so forth. I don't envy you. I'm happy I don't have to do that because it's not an easy thing. How is the dialogue in Spain actually with the decision makers?
I guess it depends on the region because we have some decisions that are taken at the national level, but a lot of those decisions are also taken regionally. So depending on the color of the government for that region, then the dialogue is better or not so good. At a national level, we currently have an office for scientific advisory to the different ministries. So we currently since like 2 years ago. Every ministry has a scientist that works there, advising them on the latest science. So trying to bring scientific evidence into decision making, which I think is really good. And they've also established now research and policy stays for researchers that want to go to one of these ministries and work on a specific challenge that these ministries have and provide scientific evidence. So I think in this sense, we are at one of the best times for science in the government. But then again, because a lot of the decisions are really taking at a regional level, there's so much more that we need to do regionally. And yeah, that depends on the different regions.
I was trying not to introduce too many abbreviations, but there's one that I wanted you to explain on the solutions part, and it's called RED Plus. Am I reading RED? I don't know, RED or
Red
whatever.
Plus.
RED Plus.
Yes.
There we go. What's that?
RED Plus stands for reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. And the plus there means also conservation and sustainable forest management. And it's a mechanism that was created under the UN climate framework. And the basic idea of this is kind of a payment for ecosystem services, and there are different ways of having these payments. This is just one of them. But the idea is that forests, they store a lot of carbon. So when they are cut down or when they are degraded, that carbon is released into the atmosphere. And so with these programs, what they aim is to create some financial incentives for countries. It's mainly countries in the global south because they are the ones that have the greatest forest extensions and the greatest carbon storage there, to keep those forests standing instead of converting them into other land uses like agriculture or just cutting them down. So in theory, it's like a win-win solution where those governments reduce rainforest degradation and carbon emissions are reduced. At the same time, that plus stands because biodiversity is also protected when you are doing that. So in theory, it's a really good thing. It has many, many challenges on how it's implemented. It requires a lot of strong governments, local participation, and it sometimes it's been tricky, but I think it's a great idea.
I wanted to discuss this again, not getting into too much detail, because as you're saying, in theory and then the practice, that's a different story. But I wanted to jump from biodiversity and then the species we discussed, pollinators, but hummingbirds themselves, more agricultural land use, but also forests, because this is also another topic that you look into, deforestation and forests as such, right? So just to finish off with this before we solve the pub quiz question, actually, I guess a classic question, but I have to ask it. Should forests be managed in any way, or should we just leave them? What's going on? There are so many people working in the forest, how do you say it? Forestries, I guess that's the English word, who are managing them. There are many people who are not doing it, and there's lots of discussions. And there are also the scientists on the side who are also talking about it. So what is your take on this?
I think it really depends, and a single answer wouldn't be realistic. So protection of forests, I think, is really important, but management sometimes can also be important, because when you completely exclude people from some areas, sometimes it's not the best solution. Selective logging, if done carefully, can actually maintain forest structure and biodiversity. If done in a bad way, then it can be really bad for the forest. But working in Borneo, for example, we found that forests that had been logged once and even twice, they still hosted a huge amount of diversity in those areas, and they were really worth conserving. So for example, in Borneo, what happens is that once forests are logged twice, they are then completely cleared and replaced by oil palm plantations. So what we found in our studies is that actually those forests are really worth keeping and shouldn't be changed into oil palm plantations, because at the end of the day, we also have to take into account that there's people in those areas that have livelihoods and then that need to make a living. And so if you are telling them, no, you can't cut the forest, no, you can't do oil palm, no, you can't do that, well, what are they supposed to live from? So I think managing forests in a way that people can extract some resources but still protect a lot of the diversity there is the best solution. Another thing is what's done, for example, in Europe, where forests are really managed. And for example, in the area where I live, most of the mountains and most of the forests here are plantations. and we are keeping very little of our native vegetation. So I think here the problem would be different. So again, depending on the area, you need more or less management.
So if you don't have really native vegetation, would you advocate for reintroducing it or not really?
Reintroducing it or just letting the system recover, remove those plantations. So for example, there's a lot of areas here where there was pine trees planted, pine trees that come from Monterey in California, and they were planted because the wood is then extracted. And recently there's been a disease caused by a fungi in those trees, and because it's a monoculture, that fungi has just been going from one tree to the other to the other to the other with no different trees to stop the invasion of this fungi, and it has just destroyed a lot of these trees, and they ended up having to cut all those trees. So the question now is, what should they do? And they are thinking of planting eucalyptus, which is also not a native species. So I think that when those things happen is when we really have to reflect on our actions and see, well, this didn't lead us anywhere good. So maybe we should change what we're doing and use those opportunities to really let native vegetation or a more diverse plantation type.
Why eucalyptus?
Because these species, they are selected by foresters because they are very productive. In very few years, they can then cut the whole thing and make a profit. Yeah, it's a lot of the eucalyptus used for pulp, so I guess it's good for that. Whereas the native species we have here, it takes longer for them to grow to a level where they can be cut, and maybe they're not as good for pulp. I don't really know, but yeah, those pines and eucalypts are favored in plantations.
Okay, so I can see you have a lot to do still, for sure. And to sum up, it would really do well, all of us, if we thought more about diversity, also in this context, really diversity of things, but also in general, the profit part. I don't like that. But yeah, that's just me and my values. Let's leave it there and go back to the pub quiz question. So if you can remind our listeners what the question was and then give us the answer.
Okay, so my question was, which group is more diverse across the world, birds or bees? And the answer is bees. So bees have 20,000 species across the world, whereas birds have only half of that, so like 10,000 species.
This is a very fascinating fact, I have to say, because again, in my imagination, as we discussed before, honeybees, maybe some types of wild bees, but I would never imagine there are so many species.
Yeah. So just in the Iberian Peninsula, we have like 1,100 bee species.
Is there anything else we need to tell the listeners about pollinators as we went back to them right now, or hummingbirds, something that you would like people to be left with when they think about them?
There's a lot of species that pollinate. It's not just bees. When you think of bees, it's just honeybees, but there's all these 20,000 species of bees that are doing pollination work. Also a lot of flies, a lot of beetles, a lot of bird species, even lizards in some occasions that are doing this pollination. That pollination is really important because 85% of plant species depend on these pollinators to set fruit. So a lot of the diverse landscapes that we see across the world are maintained because there's pollinators doing their work there. But not only wild species. 70% of the crops that we consume also depend on pollinators. So a lot of the food you eat when you have breakfast and you have all these nice fruits, a lot of them were pollinated by these fantastic animals. So remember them every morning when you have your blueberries.
And I have to ask you, I'm sorry, that's not going to leave this message so clear. Can we find a technological solution then?
I mean, there's always technological solutions that can be found, for example, to monitor populations of different species and see how they're doing. I like more those kinds of technological solutions than other solutions that I've seen, like creating small drones to replace bees. I don't like that solution very much. But anything technological to be able to monitor how species are doing, I think is really great. And AI can also help trying to identify those species in videos. There's a lot of technological things that can be done.
But going back, next time you have blueberries, think of all the pollinators. Ainhoa, thank you so much for today, for scratching a little bit the surface of your work.
Thank you for having me and for the work that you're doing.
Thank you. And listeners, remember, you can find us on all the social media. You can listen to the podcast on all the podcasting platforms. And if you feel like suggesting guests, remember that we're also on Patreon. And if you join as a supporter of Patreon, you can also suggest the guests and have a chat with us. This was Silax, and my name is Hanna Siemaszko.